Hi folks, I am Marina Namchu and welcome back to my channel Prep Up with Marina. Today I will be continuing with the same chapter, that is A Gorilla in the Guest Room, where we had left in my previous video. This is the second part of the video, so those of you who have not watched the first part of A Gorilla in the Guest Room, please do make it a point to go through my previous video. So without wasting much time, we will continue with the chapter, and those of you, if you wish to follow line by line, then we continue from page 80. Within 12 months, Npongo had almost doubled his size, and I felt it was now time to try, by fair means or foul, to obtain a mate for him. So, after 12 months, Npongo had almost, become double his size. That means he had become very huge. And the narrator, he decided that by any means, he was going to get a mate for Npongo. Unless they lack finances, I have no use for zoos that acquire animals purely for exhibition and make no effort to provide them with a mate. This applies particularly to apes. So, here we can see that the narrator was very keen and he always kind of encouraged even the zoos to provide mates for the apes. The problem does not arise while they are young, for they accept the human beings around them as their adopted, for if slightly eccentric family. Then comes the time when they are so powerful that you do not, if you have any intelligence, treat them in the same intimate way. Why? Now this is because they will have become double their size. So you cannot treat them the same way as they were when they are young and smaller in size. When a gorilla or chimpanzee or an orangutan at the age of 3 or 4 pulls your legs from under you or jumps from a considerable height onto the back of your neck, it tests your stamina to the full and is done because you are the only companion with whom he can play. If he is left on his own and is a nice-natured ape, he will try to play the same games with you when he is 11 or 12. This means a broken leg or a broken neck. So, when a gorilla or a chimpanzee or an orangutan, as the author tells us, when they play with you when they are little, it is all right. But if they reach the age of 11 or 12, and if they do the same thing, if they play the same pranks on you, then it would mean that you will be hurt. The human being will be hurt. So you have to be careful. So if this friendly, exuberant means very energetic animal, is kept on his own and deprived of both the company of his own kind and that of human beings, you can hardly be surprised if he turns into a morose and melancholy creature. So, the narrator tells us that if you leave an animal like this, an animal which is so, energetic, if you leave it on its own without providing a mate, then that animal will turn into a very sad, a very morose creature. Not wanting to see Pongo degenerate is to decline, into one of those magnificent but sad and lonely anthropoids that I have seen in many zoos, including some that had ample resources for providing a mate, I thought the time had come to try to procure means to provide, a wife for Pongo, even though I knew that our funds would probably not stretch that far. So, the narrator tells us here that, he had in fact seen many zoos where they had not, even in spite of the fact that they could have managed to provide mates, they had not done so. But he did not want this happening to Pongo. So although they did not have the finances, the required finances, but he was determined to get Pongo a mate. I telephoned the dealer from whom we had gotten Pongo and asked him about the possibilities of obtaining a female gorilla. So he got in touch with the same animal dealer from whom he had got Pongo. He told me he had just been ordered one, a year or so younger than Pongo. But now, owing to the political situation in Africa, the price had increased and he was asking £1,500. So earlier we saw in my previous video that a Pongo, the narrator had bought Pongo for £1,200. Now they were asking for £1,500 for the female gorilla. There followed 2 days of soul searching. I knew we could not afford that amount of money in a lump sum, in totality, okay? But we might be able to do it if it was spread over a period. So the narrator was thinking, they would not be able to furnish that amount of money, that much of money, that is £1,500 at a go. But maybe on installments, then, they could manage to then buy the female gorilla. Once again, I telephoned the dealer and asked him whether he would consider letting us have the animal on installment terms. To his credit and to my relief, he agreed and said that his representative would bring her over to Jersey in a week's time. So the animal dealer, he did agree, for the narrator to pay on installment basis. The whole zoo waited for that day with bated breath. Bated breath means, with a feeling of anxiousness or, excitement, right? Prompted by a slightly acrimonious, angry or bitter conversation with my bank manager, spent the week by having a collecting box made over which hung the notice. We have bought Nandi on the installment plan. Please help us to keep up the installments. So Nandi arrived, crouched in a crate that I would have considered small for a squirrel. So that means Nandi was really very small when she was first brought to the zoo. She, like Pongo, appeared to be in perfect condition. Her fur was glossy, it was very shiny. She was fat and her skin had a sheen like satin. A shine, like satin. But at first sight of her, it was her eyes that impressed me most. Sorry. Pongo's eyes, as I have said, were small and deep-set, calculating and full of humor. Nandi's eyes were large and lustrous, and when she looked sideways, she showed the whites of them. But they were frightened eyes that did not look at you squarely, that did not look at you full on the face, right? She looked very scared. They were the eyes of an animal that had little experience of human beings. But even that limited experience had given her no reason to trust or respect them. So something must have happened which had made Nandi, very apprehensive when she was around human beings. When we released her from her cage, I could see the reasons. Right across the top of her skull was a scar, which must have measured 6 or 7 inches in length. That was quite a big scar. Obviously, when she was being caught, some over-enthusiastic and intrepid means fearless, human being had given her a blow with a machete. What is a machete? It's a broad and heavy knife, which had split, it had cut open her scalp like a razor slash. It must have been a glancing blow, or her skull would have been split in two. So it was a glancing blow, means, it was not, sorry, the machete had not really hit her deep enough, okay? Otherwise, her skull would have been split into two. With such an introduction to the human race, you could hardly blame Nandi for being a little antisocial, for not being friendly towards human beings. This great slash was by now completely healed, and there was only the long white scar to be seen through the hair of her head, which reminded me of the curious, imitative, and quite unnecessary partings that so many Africans carve in their hair with the aid of a razor. So the scar, that the mark which had been left on her skull, on Nandi's skull, it looked like something like you would, the narrator normally saw on an African's head, which they deliberately carved out with the aid of a razor. We kept Nandi in a separate cage for 24 hours so that she could settle down. They did not keep Nandi and Pongo together all at once. The cage was next to Pongo's to enable her to see her future husband, but she evinced means revealed or showed, as little interest in him as she evinced in us. So, she did not show any interest in Pongo, like the way she did not show interest in the human beings around her in the zoo. If you tried to talk to her and look directly at her face, her eyes would slide from side to side, meeting yours only for a sufficient length of time to judge what your next action might be. So she really did not trust the humans around her. Eventually, deciding that the wire between herself and us rendered us comparatively harmless, and preferring not to look at us, she did turn her back. She had such a woe-begone, frightened face that one longed to be able to pick her up and comfort her. But she had been too deeply hurt, and this was the last thing she would have appreciated. That means she would not have appreciated, although the narrator and the others, in the zoo would have loved to pick her up and, kind of hold her close. Yet she would not have appreciated that. That was the last thing she would have wanted. And there's a word here, woe-begone. Woe-begone means to feel or to look very sad. Okay. Now this was how Nandi looked. She had a woe-begone and very frightened look. It would take us, I reckoned means I concluded, roughly at least 6 months to gain her confidence, even with the example of the pro-human Pongo. So, the narrator realized that it would take some time for Nandi to acclimatize to the surrounding, as well as to get friendly with the human beings, no matter Pongo was there. The morning when we let her into the cage with Pongo was a red letter day. It was a very important day, but wrought with anxiety, but it was filled with anxiety. He had by now become so well established and was such a fearfully extroverted character. Pongo was a very extroverted character, that he obviously considered he was the only gorilla in the world and all human beings were his friends. We did not know how he would react to Nandi's sullenness. Sullenness means her sulkiness, okay? An anti-human attitude. Although for 24 hours he could see her in the cage alongside him, he had shown absolutely no interest in her presence. Thus, when the great moment of introduction came, we stood by with buckets of water, brushes, nets, and long sticks, just in case the engagement party did not come off with the same romantic swing that one expects from reading women's magazines. So the day they were going to introduce, Pongo to Nandi, the people in the zoo, the staff, they were all very apprehensive. So they were all prepared in case the meeting did not go off well. They were prepared with buckets and brushes and sticks and all that, and nets. When all was ready, we opened the shutters, and Nandi, looking thoroughly distrustful, she did not trust anyone, saddled her way, that means walked in a very shy way, from the small cage into Pongo's comparatively palatial quarters. So Nandi was put in a smaller cage than Pongo's, because Pongo, the cage that he had was more palatial. Palatial means it was very large and more impressive compared to Nandi's. There she put her back to the wall and squatted. Squatted means she crouched, her eyes darting. Darting means looking here and there, a very fast movement, okay? To and fro with a curiously suspicious yet belligerent means hostile expression on her face. Now that she was actually in the cage with Pongo, who was sitting up on a branch, watching her with the same expression of uninterested mistrust that he reserved for some new item of diet, we could see that she was very much smaller than he. In fact, only about half his size. So, Pongo was there, he was there on the branch, but, he was really not interested in Nandi, okay, at that moment. They sat steadily contemplating. Contemplating means thinking deeply and carefully, all right. They sat steadily contemplating each other. They were just studying, each other for some minutes. While we on the other side of the wire did hasty means quick checks to make sure that all our buckets of water and so on were easily accessible, available, so that if anything had to go wrong between Nandi and Pongo, they would be ready. This was the critical moment. The two gorillas and ourselves were frozen into immobility. That means, they didn't move. There was no movement at all. To any spectator who did not know the circumstances, we would have appeared like one of the more bizarre of Madame Tussaud's exhibits. All right. Now, what is the meaning of bizarre? Bizarre means, strangely unconventional. Then Pongo stretched out a black hand with fingers like great sausages, clasped the wire, and rolled himself carefully to the ground. There he paused and examined a handful of sawdust as though it were the first time he had ever come across such a commodity. In a casual, swaggering manner, swaggering means walking in a very confident way, he sauntered means he walked in an idle manner, in a semicircle which took him close to Nandi. So slowly he started walking, towards Nandi, and then without looking at her, but with the utmost speed, lightning speed, okay? He reached out a long, powerful arm, gripped a handful of her hair and pulled it, then hurried along the perimeter of the cage as though nothing had happened. So he did it so fast. Nandi by nature has always been, and I fear will always be, a little slow in the uptake. In the uptake means in understanding things. And so Pongo was some 6 feet away before she realized what had happened. So she, Nandi was not even given the chance to kind of, realize what Pongo was doing to her, or had done to her. By then, the baring of her teeth and a grunt of indignation means anger, she was angry, were quite useless because Pongo had already left by then. The first round, therefore, went to Pongo. But before he could get exalted views of male superiority, I felt that we should bring up our second line of defense. We removed the buckets and nets and produced 2 large dishes full of a succulent selection of fruits. Succulent means very juicy selection of fruits. One was presented to Pongo and one to Nandi. There was one slight moment of tension when Pongo, having examined his own plate, first he examined his own plate, looked at his own plate, decided that possibly Nandi's contained additional delicacies which his lacked, and went off to investigate. So, they got rid of the buckets and the brushes and they kept two plates, all right, full of succulent or juicy fruits. But Pongo first, he looked at his own and then he wanted to inspect and see whether Nandi had got something extra, more extra than him. So he went to inspect her plate. Nandi, however, still smarting. Smarting means, still feeling the pain after having been, after having had her hair pulled, all right? Under the indignity of having had her hair pulled, greeted Pongo's investigation of her plate with such a display of belligerence that Pongo, being essentially a good-humored and cowardly creature, retreated means went back, to his own pile of food. For the next half hour, they both fed contentedly at opposite ends of the cage. So both of them did not disturb each other. They ate from their own plates. That night, Pongo, as usual, slept on his wooden shelf, while Nandi, looking like a thwarted means defeated, suffragette means, one who's working for the rights of women, curled up on the floor. All through the following day, they had little jousts. Jousts means arguments with each other to see who would occupy what position. To see who would occupy what position. So, there were arguments between them for the rest of the day because both of them, they were arguing about who would sleep where and which place they would occupy. They were working out their own protocol. Protocol means their own diplomatic negotiation. Should Nandi be allowed to swing on the rope when Pongo was sitting on the crossbeam? Should Pongo be allowed to pinch means steal Nandi's carrots even though they were smaller than his own? It had the childishness of a general election, but was 3 times as interesting. So they were deciding, what they should do, what each one of them should do. However, by that evening, Nandi had achieved what amounted to votes for female gorillas, and both she and Pongo shared the wooden shelf. Judging by the way Pongo snuggled up to her, snuggled means got closer to her in a comfortable position, he was not at all averse. Averse means, he did not oppose. Averse to this invasion of his bedroom. So he did not mind Nandi coming and occupying a space in his bedroom. It was obvious from the first that the marriage of the gorillas was going to be a success. Although they were so different in character, they quite plainly adored one another. Pongo was the great giggling clown of the pair, while Nandi was much quieter, more introspective. More introspective means someone, who examines one's thoughts and feelings, She was very quiet, very thoughtful, and watchful too. Pongo's bullying and teasing of her was all done without any malice. So, Pongo used to tease her, used to bully her, but he did it without any harm. He did not do it to cause harm to Nandi. And out of a pure sense of fun, it was just out of fun. And Nandi seemed to realize this. So Nandi seemed to understand that Pongo was just being playful. Occasionally, however, his good-humored teasing would drive her to distraction. It must have been rather like being married to a professional practical joker. When she reached the limit of her endurance means her ability to bear, she would lose her temper and with flashing eyes and open mouth would chase him round the cage while he ran before her giggling hysterically. So, normally Nandi did not show any kind of anger towards Pongo whenever he was, trying to pull her leg or joke with her, But at times, she would really get annoyed and then chase him around the cage. If she caught him, she would belabor him. She used to thump him or beat him with her fists while Pongo lay on the ground curled up in a ball. He would find it really funny, Nandi might as well have tried to hurt a lump of cement, in spite of her strength, for he would just lie there laughing to himself, his eyes shining with good humor. That is because, Nandi thumping him and beating him up made no difference because Pongo was a very strong and huge gorilla. Okay, so it did not really harm him. He found it funny. As soon as she tried As soon as she tired of trying to make some impression on his muscular body, Nandi would stalk off means walk off, to the other end of the cage, and Pongo would sit up, brush the sawdust from himself, and beat a rapid tattoo of triumph on his chest or stomach, like how the apes do, okay? Then he would sit with his arms folded, his eyes glittering, working out some other trick to annoy his wife. So he would always be, thinking of something, some way to annoy Nandi. To have acquired such a pair of rare and valuable animals was, I considered, something of an achievement, but now I discovered we were to live in a constant state of anxiety over their health and well-being. Every time one of them got sawdust up his nose and sneezed, we viewed this with alarm and despondency. All right, what is the meaning of despondency? Despondency means a state of being sad or, a state of feeling hopeless, all right? So, they were really worried about their health. Was this a prelude? Prelude means, was this just the beginning or an introduction to pneumonia or something worse? This was, what they used to think. The functioning of their bowels became a daily topic of conversation. I had installed a magnificent communication apparatus in the zoo, for small though it was, it could take a considerable length of time to locate the person required at the moment you wanted him. So, at various salient means very relevant points throughout the grounds, some black boxes were screwed to the walls, through which the staff could speak with the main office and vice versa. So the narrator had fixed these boxes, through which they could communicate, and if anything was wrong with either of the gorillas, then they would inform the narrator. One of these boxes was also installed in our flat, so that I could be apprised. Apprised means told of what was going on and be warned should any crisis arise. If there was any trouble, then the narrator would get the first-hand information. The occasion when I had doubts as to the wisdom of this system was the day when we were entertaining some people we did not know very well. In the middle of one of those erudite and futile, erudite means, showing knowledge that is learnt by studying something, okay? Erudite, and futile means useless. So in the middle of one of those erudite and futile conversations one has to indulge in, the black box on the bookcase gave a warning crackle. And before I could leap up to switch it off, a sepulchral, that is a very hollow and deep and disembodied voice said, something which is not very clear, okay? Mr. Durrell, the gorillas have got diarrhea again. I know of no equal to this remark for putting a blight on a party. Putting a blight on a party means, frustrating plans or hopes. Because, suddenly, they were kind of having this conversation, and he had these guests over whom he did not know very well, and suddenly he got the news that the gorillas were suffering from diarrhea. All right, so this really troubled him, upset him. However, Pongo and Nandi grew apace. Apace means they grew up rapidly and very quickly. And to our relief, developed none of the diseases that we feared they might contract. Then came Pongo's first real illness. I had just arranged to spend 3 weeks in the south of France, which was to be a sort of working holiday, for we were to be accompanied by a BBC producer whom I hoped to convince of the necessity for making a film about life in Kamaki. Hotels had been booked. Numbers of people, ranging from bullfighters to ornithologists. Ornithologists, it's a branch of zoology that deals with the scientific study of birds. They also had been alerted for our coming, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. So it was supposed to be a very big conference kind of a thing. Then, 4 days before we were due to depart, Pongo started to look off color. He started to look sick. Gone was his giggling exuberance, his enthusiasm. He lost his enthusiasm. He lay on the floor or on the shelf, his arms wrapped around himself, staring into space and taking only enough food and milk to keep himself alive. Suddenly he lost appetite. He lost all interest in everything. The only symptom was acute diarrhea. Acute means very severe diarrhea he was having. Tests were hurriedly made and the advice of both the vet and medical profession acted upon. But what he was suffering from remained a mystery. So no matter, they got the vet and they got other professionals, to see as to what was wrong with him, but they were not able to diagnose anything. As with all apes, he lost weight with horrifying rapidity. On the second day, he stopped eating altogether and even refused to drink his milk. So this meant we could administer no antibiotic because he was, on empty stomach, they cannot administer any kind of medicine. Almost as we watched, his face seemed to shrink and shrivel. Shrivel means become dry and wrinkle. And his powerful body grow gaunt. Gaunt means very thin. He started becoming very thin now. What had once been a proudly rotund paunch, rotund means very round belly, now became a ghastly declivity. Declivity means, his stomach started like, it had a downward slope, right? Shrinking, where his ribs forked. Now his diarrhea was quite heavily tinged with blood. Now the diarrhea, his stool was tinged with blood. Tinged means it was, there were traces of blood in it. And at this symptom, I think most of us give up hope. They give up hope. They thought that he would not get well again. We felt that if he would only eat something, it might at least give him some stamina to withstand whatever disease he was suffering from, as well as rouse him out of the terrible melancholia into which he was slipping, as most of the anthropoids do when they are ill. So, the staff at the zoo and the narrator, all of them, they were just hoping that, Pongo would eat something at least, so that he could fight off whatever was troubling him. Jackie and I went down to the market in St. Helier and walked among the multicolored stalls that surround the charming Victoria fountain with its plaster cherubims, cherubim means angels, its palms and maidenhair fern, and its household cavalry, the plump scarlet goldfish. It was difficult to know what to choose for Pongo that would tempt his appetite, for he had such a variety of food in his normal diet. So, the narrator and his wife Jackie, they went down to the market to try and get something which would interest Pongo so that he would want to consume it. All right. Now, so we bought out of season delicacies that cost us a small fortune. So they bought certain things which was, out of season. It was, not the season for those fruits to be sold at that point of time. So it cost them quite a lot of money. Then, when we were loaded down with exotic fruits and vegetables, I suddenly noticed on a stall that we were passing an immense green and white watermelon. Watermelon is not to everyone's taste. Everybody, doesn't like, they don't like watermelon. But I personally prefer it to ordinary melon. It occurred to me that the bright pink-colored scrunchy means crunchy, watery interior with its glossy black seeds might be something that would appeal to Pongo, for as far as I knew, he had never sampled means tasted or tried it before. We added the gigantic means huge or big melon to our loads and drove back to the zoo. By now, through lack of food and drink, Pongo was in a very bad way. Jeremy had managed to to force him to drink a little skimmed milk. Skimmed means non-fat milk by the subterfuge. Subterfuge means, in a very dishonest or in a very, clever way. by the subterfuge of rubbing a disprin on his gums. The disprin, of course, dissolved rapidly, and the taste not being to his liking, Pongo was only too happy to take a couple of gulps of the milk to wash out his mouth. So in this way, he had been able to drink milk. One by one, we presented him with the things we had obtained in the market, and one by one, he viewed them with an apathetic glance. Apathetic means not showing much interest, okay? He refused the hothouse grapes, the avocado pears, and other delicacies. He refused them. Then we cut him a slice of watermelon, and for the first time, he displayed signs of interest. He prodded the slice. Prodded means he pushed and he poked, okay? He touched it. He prodded the slice with his finger and leaned forward to smell it carefully. He was showing some interest in the watermelon. The next minute, he had the slice in his hands and to our great delight started to eat. But we did not become too jubilant. Jubilant means they did not become too overjoyed. For we knew that the watermelon contained practically no nutrient, but at least it had aroused his interest in food again. The next thing was to try to administer an antibiotic, as by now the expert consensus was that he was suffering from a form of colitis. Now, what is colitis? It's a disease that causes pain and swelling in the colon. Since he still refused to take any quantity of liquid in which we could mix medicines, there was only one way to get the antibiotic into him, and that was by injection. We enticed means to lure, okay? They lured Pongo out of his cage and kept Nandi shut up. He would be sufficiently difficult to deal with. In spite of his emaciated condition, emaciated means weakened. Despite the fact that he had become very weak, yet it would be difficult to handle him and to control him. Without having any assistance from his by now extremely powerful wife. So, they shut Nandi up because it would have been difficult to manage Pongo just by himself alone, and they could not afford to bring Nandi there, to have Nandi there, because even Nandi had become very powerful. She had also become very strong. He squatted on the floor. Squatted means he sat on the floor of the mammal house, staring about with dull, sunken eyes. Jeremy squatted on one side of him, with a supply of watermelon to try to maintain his interest, while I, on the other side, quickly prepared the syringe for the injection. Pongo watched my preparations with a mild interest and once put out his hand gently to try to touch the syringe. When I was ready, Jeremy endeavored means he made an effort to distract his attention with pieces of melon. So when the narrator was ready with the injection, Jeremy tried to distract Pongo. And as soon as his head was turned away from me, I pushed the needle into his thigh and pressed the plunger home. All right, the plunger is the part of that syringe which moves up and down. Pongo gave no sign of having even noticed this, so he did not actually feel anything. He followed us obediently back into his cage and, with a small piece of watermelon, retired to his shelf, where he curled up on his side, his arms folded, and stared at the wall. The following morning, he showed very slight means very little, signs of improvement. And using the same subterfuge, we managed to give him another injection. So in the same manner, again, by distracting him, the narrator, he administered the injection. For the rest of the day, there seemed no change in him. And although he ate some of the melon and drank a little skimmed milk, he did not show any radical signs of progress. So he did not show any, great change, okay? I was now in a quandary. Quandary means in a dilemma. In 24 hours, I was due to leave for France. There I had organized and stirred up a bee's nest of helpers and advisors. Remember, he was supposed to, have gone to southern France. The BBC were also under the impression that the trip was a foregone conclusion. Foregone means a predictable conclusion, okay? If I put it off at this juncture, at this point, I would have put a tremendous amount of people to a lot of trouble for nothing. And yet I felt I could not leave Pongo unless I was satisfied that he was either on the mend or beyond salvation. Salvation means beyond help. So what happened was, the narrator was supposed to go. All right, everything had been arranged. He had to go to France. But he did not want to leave until and unless he was sure that, Pongo was well, or they would not be able to help him at all. All right. So then the day before I was due to leave, he suddenly turned the corner. Suddenly there was a slight change in him. He started drinking his Complan, a highly concentrated form of dried milk, and eating a variety of fruits. By the evening of that day, he showed considerable signs of improvement and had eaten quite a bit of food. The next morning, I went down very early to look at him, for I was due to catch my plane to Dinard at 8:30. He was sitting up on the shelf, and although he still looked emaciated, although he still looked very weak and unwell, his eyes had a sparkle that had been lacking for the past few days. So there was a slight change in him. He ate quite well and drank his Complan, and I felt that he was at last on the road to recovery. I drove down to the airport and caught the plane to Dinard, and we motored down to the south of France. It cost a small fortune in long-distance calls to Jersey to keep myself apprised means informed of Pongo's progress, but every time I telephoned, the reports got better. And when Jeremy informed me that Pongo had drunk 1 pint of Complan and eaten 3 slices of watermelon, 2 bananas, 1 apricot, 3 apples, and the whites of 8 eggs, I knew there was no further cause for alarm. So, the day the narrator is supposed to have left, for Dinard, what happens is that day there is a sudden change in Pongo. There is a sparkle in his eyes. Then he starts drinking the Complan. He starts eating the fruits. So, so after seeing his condition, the narrator leaves for France. And then, despite the fact that, for long distance calls, like, it took quite a lot of money, but still, the narrator, he is in touch with his staff members at the zoo, and the staff members also inform him that they inform him about the recovery of Pongo. So then the narrator knows that now there is nothing to fear. By the time I returned from France, Pongo had put on all the weight he had lost, and when I went into the mammal house where he was to greet me, his old self, massive, black and rotund, round and plump, his eyes glittering mischievously as he tried to invigil means to achieve control over somebody, okay? Invigil me close enough to the wire so that he could pull the buttons of my coat. I reflected as I watched him rolling on his back and clapping his hands in an effort to attract my attention, that, though it was delightful to have creatures like this, and of vital importance that they should be kept and bred in captivity, it was a two-edged sword. For the anxiety you suffered when they became ill made you wonder why you started the whole thing in the first place. So the narrator says here that, though it's a pleasure, it's good to keep animals like this in the zoo, but at times, especially times like this when they fall ill, then these are the times they have to face a lot of problems, because then they wouldn't want to lose the animals, and they would want to save the animals. So, keeping them in the zoo is, it's not an easy thing. It's quite difficult because they have to face all these problems and, all these problems, especially when the animals are very ill. So with this, boys and girls, we have come to the end of the lesson, that is a gorilla in the guest room. And this, as I told you, is the second video of the chapter. And those of you who have not watched, I will again repeat myself, please make it a point to watch part 1, or else the second part will not make much sense to you. So with that, I would like to end by saying, stay tuned. Bye-bye.